Hi, everyone, and welcome to our exclusive author interview series. Today, we are sitting with none other than Alex Fishbein, who is a big name in chess, not just as a player, the Grandmaster, but also as an author. Hi, Alex. Thank you for joining us today.
How are you doing, Charlize? It's great to be here.
So we're going to start off with some questions that's some like general questions because I'm quite interested to hear who your favorite players, your favorite books are. So number one, I just said it, but who is your favorite chess player?
That's a tough one, actually, because it varies from week to week. I guess when I was growing up, probably in the early days in the 1970s, I my favorite player and chess figure was probably Aaron Nimzovich. Then
Yeah.
a little bit later, like in terms of like learning from modern players, I would say probably Karpov, and then and also Korchnoi. I think I grew up in the Soviet Union. I was born in the Soviet Union in 1968, and it was during the Karpov the rise of Karpov. Like when I was starting out in chess, Karpov had just become world champion, and
Yeah.
his games were the number. His games were the ones that we all studied. But then
Yeah.
in the late 1970s, we were preparing to go to emigrate to the United States, and Viktor Korchnoi was playing the match against Karpov, the second match they played in 1978, the World Championship match, the first World Championship match, the one in Baguio. Um, I already knew that he was kind of a hated, like a sort of a canceled figure, so to speak, in the Soviet Union, having kind of been a defector, right? So they didn't really mention his name. Like and I was very interested in the match, and whenever I listened to the radio commentary, it was like, the world champion Karpov playing against his opponent, or the opponent, or
Oh, wow. They didn't even
the
mention
yeah,
his
like the
name.
name was never mentioned. Opponent, enemy
Mm.
sometimes.
Oh,
And I was paying close attention to the match. Towards the end, it suddenly became tied 5-5. And now I was as a Soviet kid, I was like, I think 10 years old at the time, and not yet aware that we were about to emigrate. Not yet. My parents were, but I was not yet aware of that. So I was still kind of like a Russian schoolboy,
mm.
right? And I was obviously rooting for Karpov. And then suddenly, like, the score became 5-5, and my dad came home and he showed me the game 31, and which Karpov, of course, tied the match in a very, very famous game. And from his voice, it seems like he's rooting for Korchnoi, and I didn't understand why. So, like, at that point, I think I started becoming a fan. And also, I played the Open Ruy Lopez, which, as you probably know, Korchnoi was a big, you know, he really brought that system back into popularity in the 1970s. And my trainer in Russia, Vladimir Zak, was a big proponent of that system as well. So because of those two reasons and the immigration, everything, Korchnoi became my favorite player. I
Oh,
think in the late 70s and early 80s. So
yeah.
going back, I've done a lot of work on both of those players. I would say they're probably my two favorite players of that era. Maybe, I mean, Bobby Fischer, obviously, I know all his games. Everybody's favorite player. He had a very clean style. But I'm a student of the classics, so I kind of know a lot of it. I have all these books of old style players, classical players, or players of that era, let's say. And I think what's interesting about them is they all had a very distinctive style.
Mm.
Whereas now, I think players have a less distinct. Players are basically they all play more or less in the Fischer style, being kind of a good at everything, right?
Yeah. And the
Uh,
computer era
universal
helps with
universal
that.
players,
Mm.
universal players, right? Whereas in the past, you had people like Michael Tal, for example, let's say Petrosian. They were both extremely good tacticians, and yet like their tactical combinational ability was actually very similar, and they were good friends. But the way they played on the chessboard was so different from each other, and you had various people at that time, even later during the 90s, who had very distinctive styles. So it's interesting for me to study those games, because when I come, like, let's say I come home from a tournament, and I'm a very active player, I play a lot. Let's say I come home from a tournament, I didn't do very well. Let's say I lost a couple of games. Maybe I had trouble in positions that are end game positions. Maybe I had trouble in positions that are, on the other hand, are positions where attack is required. Or maybe I, didn't find the right plan or whatever, or maybe didn't see opponents' resources. Whatever the problem was, I can always find a player back in the past who was a parent who is just a great example of that, of not having that problem, and then going over their games, which I usually do using training mode in ChessBase, kind of gets rid of that disease for me. So it's like medicine you take after a tournament, and then you come into the next tournament with that disease cured. So basically, my favorite player is the one who I played the least like in the last bad tournament that
Okay, that's interesting. That's so cool. So that's what you're saying. It varies week to week based on your style and what you can learn from the players that you take.
I would say of authors, I would say, in Nimzovich, we're going to talk about the project I recently concluded with the Nimzovich as my system. I don't know if you're aware of that. I did a recent revision of it, which will come out next.
The fast track edition.
Fast track. Okay, so you're aware of that. Okay. So he was my favorite. I think Alekhine was also a great author. I think reading those books is interesting because, I mean, there's always sort of a dialogue of how do you read books of the past and what to do when there's mistakes in those books? Because now the engines are so strong that, I mean, even if you look through recent analysis, I mean, even if you go through, like for example, Kasparov's analysis in the Great Predecessors, or even more recent stuff than that, the engines are so strong now that you're going to find mistakes in almost every page or sometimes every paragraph. Yeah, and if you go back to the 1930s or when Alekhine was writing, I mean, there's serious mistakes in pretty much every game. And sometimes they affect the evaluation of the game and the entire assessment of, who was better and whether the plan succeeded or not. But the interesting part for me is I don't mind those mistakes in books like that, because I can go through them now and I can figure out where their understanding was flawed. Like Alekhine, for instance, what he didn't understand, or Nimzovich, and coming back to like the modern time, because I and a lot of other players, not just of my generation, but of the more recent generation. I mean, Magnus Carlsen is a extremely good student of chess history. He read all those books, and that's how he learned chess, right? He learned chess when he was, 7 or 8 years old. He knew all those books. That's where he learned. There were no computers that were very good at that time yet, right? So he's really he really grew up in the pre-computer age. So unless you're playing against 15-year-olds, they're probably going to be descendants of, in some sense, stylistic descendants of some of those players, right? And so if you know what Alekhine got wrong, then because Alekhine's a lot of his evaluations were just intuitive, right? So he made the kinds of mistakes that people will make now because it's intuition, right? And so knowing what those people got wrong is a big step towards like growing now, because you can learn, where basic intuition fails. And that's important sometimes.
Yeah. And Nimzowitsch, what would you say he got wrong? Or
he actually, so he actually, I mentioned this, I'll quickly mention this project. So the fast track of Nimzovich is my system. So Nimzovich, my system, is actually my favorite book. It remains probably my favorite book. I mean, now, unfortunately, having gone through this, it's not as mysterious anymore, but I've reread that book probably hundreds of times. Maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but I reread it. Every time there's something wrong with my game, I go back to it, right? And, I read it for the first time when I was like 7 or 8 years old in Russian. And so the way that project came about is recently that book has become a little bit controversial because a few reasons. One is that there's a lot of language there that people in the modern era find kind of weird or not accessible. They'll have jokes that people don't understand, analogies that are from the early 19th century that people just don't really relate to anymore. The second reason is there's a lot of it's a very arrogant book in some sense. Like he basically, one of the purposes of the book is, my system, to discuss his own, his own contribution to the game and explain why he did why he should be part of what he was trying to do is to earn a match for the world championship. In those days, you couldn't just there wasn't a FIDE candidates tournament. You had to basically get somebody to sponsor you. So it was more or less the book was partially just a kind of a big advertisement, and it worked, but he didn't quite get the sponsorship. So there's a lot of arguments with, various sort of less than, let's say, positive treatment of other players, including Tarish, for instance. And in the
So
book,
he
right,
was talking badly, like talking trash
about other people sometimes, right? And which, some of it was legitimate. And then the biggest reason I think that people don't like it, or those people that don't like it, is because some of the chess analysis is, and this is a textbook, right? So you can read Alekhine's book to, like, let's say 1924, 1927, or Nottingham, the tournament books, right? Those are not textbooks. So you can read those books, you can read those annotations, and okay, they're wrong sometimes, but it's very valuable to see what he thought at the time, like I explained earlier. But when it's a textbook, when it's trying to teach you, then it really needs to be correct most of the time, at least, or almost all the time. And there are a lot of mistakes. There are a lot of not just tactical mistakes, but there are some strategical mistakes. Now, what's good about it is that actually there are very few of them. You can kind of, and that's what I did, is you could modernize the book by kind of getting rid of the stuff that doesn't really work. Like, for example, overprotection is the best example of something where he just went overboard. Like he had the right idea initially. There is such a thing as overprotection. It's a form of prophylaxis. It does work in some cases. It is important. But then when you start, like building your whole theory of that one thing, and because that is what the idea of prophylaxis is something that he did introduce. That was one thing that he kind of introduced, at least to the literature, I think. But once you start,
he like coined the idea of prophylaxis, or he
I think so. I think he did. Well, the idea now for him, it was, at least in my system, it was limited to preventing pawn breaks or expansion of like pawn, what we call pawn levers or pawn breaks, preventing, let's say, freeing of the position, right? Now, so he might make something called a mysterious rook move, which doesn't actually seem to do anything, doesn't create any threat at all, except that it's the idea of it is black makes a pawn break, then that rook starts getting active, right? So that's kind of his main thesis of prophylactic. Then it became a much wider concept, and actually in the praxis of my second book, prophylaxis already means something more. But then later, like in the 1970s, when Karpov started playing, he took that theme, and Karpov's his whole method of playing is prophylaxis. So, but it's different. It's not just pawn breaks. It's just preventing strategic plans by opponent. Prophylaxis in attack, which I think Tal introduced. Sometimes you just make a quiet move when you're attacking. You don't have to always check your opponent's king. You just maybe prevent a defensive resource, things like that. But when you talk about one little aspect of overprotection, and you just start kind of going way too far with it, and he really went too far with it, then that part of the book needs to be scrapped, right? So that's an example of where kind of I took out like many pages that had that, and so I had to reorganize the material a little bit. So the fast track edition it's shorter. It's about, I'd say, 60-70% of the size, maybe. It removes the parts that don't really work. It removes all the arguments with Tarish. It keeps the best parts. It keeps like the language metaphors, pass pawn is a dangerous criminal. There's a lot of others. It keeps that. It keeps some of the jokes, the ones that make sense now. It doesn't keep the ones that there's references to, like Russian mythology, which nobody will understand anymore. So there's like all kinds of things that you kind of like, you keep the best, you throw away the stuff that really doesn't work anymore. You reorganize the material. And the good thing about that book is that most of the strategic notions remain. And that's what I was, it was interesting to me rereading it and actually rewriting it in some sense, right? Is that a lot of the strategic ideas are still valid. You look at things like outpost, blockade, weakness of squares of one color. All these things are very basic, and he explained, but they're complicated. Many of them are complicated. He explained these complicated concepts in very clear ways. That's why that book is so great, is that those concepts still make sense. They're not trivial, right? But they're explained in a way that people can understand. So what I did is, when there's tactical problems, which there are a few, I clean it up a little bit, right? Maybe I change the position slightly so it doesn't have that tactical problem, but most of the actual substance is still there. And when there are changes, I try to make it very smooth, so it seems like he just wrote it that way, as opposed to having lots of like, okay, he wrote this, I'm writing this. He doesn't have very much.
So he kept his voice in what you wrote.
Exactly, he kept his voice, and it reads as the original, as opposed to some kind of like a new version of it, right?
Oh, that's
if
awesome.
You read it, 80%, the original reader of the original will recognize pretty much all of the parts that are not italicized, and the parts that are italicized, which is the new stuff, are like 5% of the book. So I would say 80% of the book pretty much is almost exactly the original, although it's might be slightly reorganized.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the chapters might move from place to place. The games might be right below the text as opposed to the end of the chapter. Things like that. Just a better organization to make it read better, and clean up a few tactical errors here and there. And then some games that just don't make sense. There are some games that don't really work. Like for example, okay, there's such a thing as sacrifice of a pawn for a blockade, but you have to have the right example for it, right? So if it's a wrong example, I replace it with another example, which is still from his book, but kind of move it around a little bit.
Okay. So you kept the heart of the book, you kept his voice, you just changed a few things to make it easier for the modern day. That must have been quite special working on this if you've known this book for years and you've read it so much.
It was an interesting, it was interesting work. It was interesting experience, and I actually learned a lot. And I had a good streak of like successes in chess after I started writing it. I had several good results in a row. My rating went like up 50 points, and
oh wow,
which it's deflation and stuff. It's quite a bit lower now than my peak, but I think my strength is probably within about, like, there's some deflation, which is I think worth about 50 points maybe at my level, 50, 75. So I'm within like maybe, like my peak was 2550 FIDE, now I'm like 2400. But I think in reality, I've dropped maybe 75 points as my peak, which is not that bad. I mean, it's, my peak was,
for this level, that's huge. For a kid starting out with like K40, that's like nothing.
Right.
For at
K, right. It's hard to gain those 75 points now. But also I think a player who's rated, 2500, 2550 now is probably a stronger player than 2500. Well, I mean, back in like the early 90s when I had that level, I don't know. I mean, in some ways I'm stronger, in some ways I'm weaker. I definitely have more knowledge. Openings are much better, but tactical calculation, not quite there.
Yeah,
but close.
Some things
Close.
improve. Yeah.
So book in terms of like my system, but then after that, I think so. My top books probably would be my 60 Memorable Games by Bobby Fischer. He's not necessarily my favorite player, just because he doesn't have a particularly distinctive style. He's more like a computer-like player. But I think that the book is an unbelievable book. I would even put that ahead of my system in my list, because it's just such an honest description. It's the first book, I think, that actually tried to, number one, be honest about everything, and number two, try to see everything to the bottom, like try to actually get to the bottom of every position, try to explain where all the mistakes were made. I think Alekhine made a first attempt to do that in his book about in the 1924 and 27 books, but he didn't quite succeed. I think Fisher, and one thing that my friend Patrick Wolf pointed out, he's a big lover of that book as well, is one of the things that stands out in that book, as he pointed out in one of his podcasts, is that Fisher knows exactly when to go deep in the variation and when to just talk about it without looking at the variation specifically. That's a extremely important skill. So bottom line is that book, for its language and for its chess, is the #1 book in my mind, and I've reread that book many times. But I don't think I would do another version of that, because you got to keep if it's a game collection, it can have mistakes, and he didn't have a lot of mistakes, but he had mistakes too. But I think that he when that book was published, and again I read that book first in Russian in 1976 probably. So Fisher already dropped out, but I was only 8 years old. And
You were 8 years old reading chess books. Can we just like pause on that? 7, 8 reading chess books. That's wow.
Yeah. It was, well, what else? I didn't read books. It was that, and like I remember, like I was back in Russia, we had like in the summer the kids were staying outside the city in this thing called dacha, and for the summer, because we didn't, it was hot and whatever, and I was not really into sports or anything. I did a little bit of sports, but not too much. I was mainly just reading. But what was I reading? I was reading chess books. And then I remember my grandmother was reading to me like my system when I was like 8 years old. And she was also reading to me Tom Sawyer at the kind of like there was time for Tom Sawyer, and because I remember she was reading Tom Sawyer. So I just remember her reading Becky and the Indian Joe or whatever. And I don't remember anything. And then my system was like after that. So I didn't read a lot, but I did read a lot of chess books. So Fisher, that's, and then after that, probably, So what I was going to say is that his book was published in American version. The English version came out in 68, I think, or 60. Yeah, the last game is from 67, so it came out in 68 or 69. The Russian version came out, I think, right after he won all the candidates matches. So it was before the match with Spassky in 1971. And everybody read it. It became very hard to buy because everybody just bought it. And I think that's when the chess really started taking off, not just in terms of popularity, but also in terms of level of play. Because I think that the Soviets looked at that book and saw something new, saw something different they'd never seen before. So an approach to analysis of chess that they hadn't seen before. And now you start seeing a different approach to analysis at the Karpov level, like when in his match with Spassky, the preparation of that match and the analysis, much deeper, much deeper kind of questioning of what's going on in the positions, much wider understanding of the openings. You had people started playing things like the Hedgehog and other systems, King's Indian, and basically I think that Fisher just broadened the game, but I think that it was his precision that people started following. And I think that if you just look at games played in the 60s of the top players, including Fisher himself, probably almost every other game, every maybe third game you play is going to have a major blunder, like -3, 300 cent point type mistakes, or blunder of a piece or something. In his book, there's a lot of blunder. People just make blunder. You stop seeing that. In the 1970s and 80s, you start having much better level of play. And I think they used that book. I think they learned from that book because it was just such a fresh, new look at chess. And that's my theory. I don't know. So I think the Russians basically just tried to take the best of those lessons. And by the time that Karpov had qualified to play Fischer, I think he would have been the favorite. I think Fischer would have had a hard time.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that opinion before.
I think Karpov was already stronger then. Partially because Fischer hadn't played for 3 years, and he had old. It's hard not to play for that long and catch up
and come back.
I think Karpov was very strong, and so was everybody else. They just got a lot better. And if you just look at the games, it's obvious. And so, so that's the #1. I think Nimzowitsch should be #2. Dvoretsky's books, all of those are up there. I read those a lot. then you have things like, older things like Tal, Bronstein's Zurich 53, but they're a little bit, they're not as modern anymore. Tal I think still remains, so to speak, modern, but his stuff is interesting when you're like, I reread that book when I need some more excitement in my game.
Inspiration. Creative spark.
Right.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot of books. Do you have like all the physical copies of these?
Yeah, sure. Most of them are in Russian, but
Okay.
like the Fisher book I have in English. But a lot of those Russian, like the Tal Karpov books, they're all in Bronstein. I have all those, and Alekhine books. All of those are in Russian.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can read any. I'm still fluent in Russian. I can read just as well. In fact, my system translation, the Russian translation of my system, is a much better one than all the English ones were.
We have Mind System in German for free on Forward Chess, making accessible. But
Really?
I'm
Okay.
excited for the fast track edition.
The
And
ebook
all
version,
the books
right?
you've listed, the ebook
Yeah, I think
version,
the ebook of
on
the
Forward
I think
Chess.
the fast track ebook is not quite done yet, but it'll be done soon. I think the physical copy will be out in about 3 weeks. I think my
Okay.
system fast track, and
Excellent.
the ebook will be out in a little later, I think, because I don't think it's done. I don't think it's actually finished yet. The other than the Dvoretsky, I should mention you probably have the Dvoretsky Endgame manual, right?
Yes, and the fast track edition.
The fast track of the Dvoretsky Endgame. So so both of those, the fifth edition of Dvoretsky Endgame manual and the fast track edition, I worked in both of those with Carsten Mueller.
The first one, yeah.
So the fifth edition, the problem is the computers have gotten so good that the good thing about the fifth edition is we went through most of the stuff with the engines and we cleaned up a lot of errors. There's still some mistakes, even in the fifth edition, and even in the fast track.
So you had to clean up your cleanup.
The fast track probably, well, no, I don't think we introduced any mistakes, but there are some mistakes that, like, you clean up a book like that, it's a massive book, there's a lot of analysis, and there's some old stuff that we probably didn't change because we thought it was kind of like, most of the mistakes are in the sidelines. They don't affect the actual, so when you read the book, you're not really going to notice it, but there's some small mistakes here and there, and there's some evaluations of end games that have changed a little bit, I think, since then. Like, some rook endings are so complicated. And by the way, Andy Soltis, a friend of mine, wrote an article about this with this theme a few years ago in Chess Life, with this thesis that, okay, you're changing all this because the computer. Well, who's to say that the new computer is not gonna change your thing back to what it was before, right?
Yeah.
But which it kind of made me think about that, because these computers are just so much stronger, and you can put these positions into the latest Stockfish. You don't even have to have the best technology. You can just have a normal computer. I have Stockfish 16 running on just a normal PC without any kind of giga whatever, and it finds it evaluates these positions instantaneously. It like says 000, when just 3-4 years ago, we looked at the same position, it was like plus 1.5. And you couldn't tell. Plus 1.5 means you don't really know.
That's a huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't really know. Or plus 1, in a rook ending, plus 1.0, 1.5, it's, now if you do if you look at a rook ending and it says plus 1.0, and it's ending with a relatively small number of pawns, like let's say 8 pieces or 9 pieces total, 1.0 almost always means draw. Whereas in the past, 1.0 would mean you don't really know, right? So so even the Dem 5, you look at it, it's, there's a lot of positions where it says, well, white has winning chances. That's a word that doesn't really, people don't write like that anymore, because it's either a win or a draw, right? But it kind of raises a philosophical question, because at some point it's going to be, we're getting close to the point where computers have solved at least the end game, right? But how does that help the human, right? Do you really want the computer evaluation, which might be a draw, but the human would have to play perfectly, or almost like there's positions, for example, with rook versus bishop and some pawns, which the computer might evaluate as a draw by some kind of fortress, but for a human to actually keep that fortress would be next to impossible in a game. Like
Yeah.
it raises a question, and maybe in the old books, like including Dem 5, the position might be evaluated as a win, or let's say winning chances, right? Whereas now it's like either a draw or win. Do you really need? Isn't it better to maybe have the less precise but more practical evaluation? It raises a serious philosophical question. So when if we redo the Dem 5 to Dem 6, I think that question is going to be at the forefront, because I think that for personally, I am not a huge fan of these books where a bunch of computer lines are, I try to avoid that in my system fast track, where a bunch of computer lines are given without, like the word engine is obviously not mentioned in the fast track edition, right? And most of the lines, if they're engine lines, they're explained very, very carefully. There's going to be a point where book writers are going to have to give that question a serious thought, because any idiot can just open up their engine and spit out these lines, which are going to be perfect. What makes a book worth reading? Why is a book worth reading, whereas a person can just put out these variations, right? So it's going to be that kind of trade-off is going to be front and center in writing of books, because you don't want to make mistakes.
Because it's a manual, right? So you need to be able, the person needs to be able to learn from it. It's not just, I guess, regurgitation of engine games, because it's not.
But on the other, so it's both. You have to be right. You have to have the human analysis to learn from it, but you also have to have the correct theory. Some of the rook endings, like the work that we did in Dem 5, we revised the ending with a pawn and then 3 pawns on each side, right? What's called the Kantorovich-Steckner position with 3 pawns on each side.
We'll insert the position,
It was really complicated. So how much of that should the player know, and how much of that should the player feel? Those are the things we're going to have to work through when we do the new version.
Yeah.
So getting back to Carsten Mueller, that's how I learned, that's how I got to know him, is working with him on the Dvoretsky Endgame Manual, that and the Fast Track. And Carsten, by the way, great. He's very interesting person in addition to chess player. He's a mathematician. I think he has a PhD in mathematics. Very, very precise thinker. And I actually got to my son Mitch is a good player. He's about almost 2,200 FIDE, 2,150 FIDE, I think. He's a master here in the United States. So last year we visited Germany, and I got to have Mitch got to have a lesson with Carsten Mueller. I met him for the first time. We visited him at the Hamburg Chess Club. That's how I got to know him. And the Endgame Corner, which we published a few months ago, I think, right in December it came out, is a book that I worked on with Carsten. It was a lot of work. So basically it's an exercise book. You have that now in your
it's on Forward Chess Endgame Corner.
It's an exercise book. It has about, I think, 450 positions. Well, there's some difficult ones and there's some easy ones, right? They're classified by strength. They're kind of in order of strength. They're also classified by material, like rook endings, pawn endings, and they're all from games played in the last 15 years, I think.
Okay.
10, 15 years.
Yeah,
they're all recent, all of them. Most of them, almost all of them, with the exception maybe of 3 or 4, like of the 450, almost all of them are from Carsten's database. So he writes a weekly column, I think, on ChessBase. Endgame Corner was a name of, I'm going to get this wrong, was a name of either a website or the column that he wrote on one of the websites. So basically I don't know if it was in ChessBase. So he had already analyzed all these positions. He had all these notes. Some of them were in German, some of them were in English. And I know I can read German, so I was able to translate. He had already done the analysis. So my job was to kind of classify them into which ones should we take for the book, which ones are maybe too complicated or perhaps too simple,
Yeah.
or not interesting or whatever, and then classify them by theme. So you want to have too many positions in one theme. On the other hand, you want to have some of the important themes. You want to have more than one position, because one thing the book does that's kind of maybe original is that there's positions in there of the same theme that actually look very similar. Like, for example, there's a famous book, Woodpecker Method, which
Oh, yeah. Excellent.
one idea there
Yeah.
is you take a position, you take, and then you do the same exercise several times, right? Well,
Yeah.
here you don't necessarily have to do the same exercise many times. You can just do one, and then 10 pages later, you're going to get a very similar idea, because it's end games, right? Because you're going to get a
Yeah.
position with the same concept. So as the concepts repeat, and then when you get it wrong, the solution will say, okay, if you got this wrong, then you go back to this one and it's very similar to the other one. So
Right.
there's some of that. This is important. So each position has a certain number of points that you earn for solving it.
Okay.
And I think it's from 1 to 5 points. And so the 5-point positions are ones that maybe a world champion will have trouble solving, or might not solve, let's say. Whereas a 1-point position is something that basically a 12 or 1300 should be able to do in less than a minute. But so the difficulty there, the positions that are just very simple king pawn endings, that although there's that famous ending that Ferrugia messed up against Carlsen, where he moved his king to the wrong. He played he didn't do the distant opposition, right? He played a king. He was supposed to do something like king c3, and he did king d2 instead, or something, or vice versa.
Okay, I'll check that game out. Yeah.
It was in a, remember that, and that was in a that was actually in a long time control game. That was not a blitz game, not a bullet game or anything. That was actually a classical game, but it was at the end of the time control, where they had, I think it was 10 seconds. I think it was a 10-second increment, or maybe it was just a delay. I'm not sure. But in any event, 1 second should be enough for a player to find that move. Still, I give the position 2 stars, 2 points, because if a world champion level player didn't get it. So there's positions. There's a lot of different positions. So I think it's actually a really, really solid book, and I think that it can be beneficial to a lot of different players of different strengths, from the weaker to the stronger players. This point system gives you partial credit if you get, so you don't necessarily have to see the entire solution. If you see the whole solution, you get full credit. If you see only part of it, you might get partial credit. So, and that's the way it should be, because you can't be expected to get everything right. This is actually one of my previous favorite books, which I hadn't mentioned. It was probably in my top 10 or top 5, maybe top 10. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's called, the English version is called The Best Move, by Hort and Jansa.
No.
But you're familiar with Hort. You're familiar with Hort, both Vlastimil Hort and Vlastimil Jansa, right?
No, not at all. These are such foreign names to me.
Yeah, well, Hort, you're probably familiar. He was a world championship challenger in the 1970s. Vlastimil Hort. He's still alive, and so is Jansa. Jansa was actually world senior champion, I think, like 15 years ago. And so they wrote this book called, in English it's called The Best Move, and in the Russian version was called Together with the Grandmasters. The original, of course, was written in Czech, because they're both from Czechoslovakia, and I don't know what the original, in their language, what it was called, but it was an exercise book, and there's about 400 positions, and each of them has points awarded to. So I recommend that book, to points awarded to solving the positions. You get partial credit sometimes, but their format was very different. And everything else is very different from our book, in that they had mostly middle games, and they had things like, okay, evaluate the position. Is white better, black better? You get some points for that. And then there's usually multiple choice, right? So is this the right move? Is that, it's usually a multiple choice, but you have to evaluate. And I like that book. It's I went through it recently, a lot of mistakes, but what are you going to do? And it's interesting. I talked to Vlastimil. I met Jansa in 1991. I told him, you have this book. It's one of the greatest book ever written. And he's like, yeah, that book. He was, well, I probably shouldn't say it in public, but he was let's
We
just
can
say
cut it out.
he was not terribly pleased with like the contract that he had in terms of like how much he got paid for the book or things like that, right? Whereas
Okay.
so he didn't do it, so he because of that he didn't want to talk about the book. But the book
Wow.
was one of the great
Yeah, you
books. Yeah.
produced
So
this like baby basically,
yeah,
and we
exactly.
don't want to talk about it. Wow.
So I
Yeah.
think
So
the Endgame Corner, I think is a good addition to the chess literature. I think it's a
yeah.
pretty solid Endgame book. It's not the solutions, of course. There's exercise and there's solutions, and the solutions go into. I mean, you could compare with like Dvoretsky's exercises and how he looks at the solutions. Solutions kind of go deeper and give you the theory and theoretical concepts as well as just the variations. I try to do that, and I mean, my contribution was mainly just actually writing well, he had most of the annotations, but they had to, in
but
some
you put
cases, they
it
had to be
together, right?
translated.
Like you assembled the
Yeah, putting
jigsaw.
everything together, ordering it, making it seem like something that can help you learn, right? A
Hmm.
manual as opposed to just a collection of.
Cool. We have the book on Forward as well. I'll link it down below. And I wanted to ask you, well, I think I've kind of gotten a sense from you already, like how much you know about chess history and literature. But what got you into writing chess books? Because obviously you're still a very active player, you just said so. And to be
Yeah,
writing these books
that's
at
a
the
good
same time.
That's a good question. So actually, you might not know that I'm actually not a professional chess player. So I actually have a like a full-time job that is not chess related
Wow.
at all. It's I work in finance. I work on a bond trading desk for a bank, and so I've had jobs like that for 30 years, more than that, like since 1993, 30 years. I was not a professional chess player after 1993. But before that, I was very young and I tried to make a living as a professional chess player, but at that time it was much more difficult. Even if you were 2600 then, or even higher,
Yeah.
I think it was difficult to have a family, and I had a family relatively early on. Yeah, so chess was not really an option for me. I was a decent player, but I never made it the top 10 in my country in the United States. I was like top 15. And so even with that 2550 rating, but I stayed active. I stayed early years. I was less active. Like the 1990s, I was not very active. I had some good results, but I was playing like twice a year. And I
Wow.
had written 2 books. So I had written 2 books already. I wrote a book about Fisher. It's just called Fisher. It's a pretty good book, pre-computer analysis, some new ideas there, and a lot of mistakes. And I wrote a book about endings called King and Pawn Endings. That was published. So both of those books were published in 1993. And Fisher might have been a little later, like 94, 95. The King and Pawn Endings book was good. I think that still stands. I think I'm more proud of that one. It doesn't have any mistakes, and that I
Wow,
know of,
still
maybe like.
like so many years
Well,
later.
but the King and Pawn endings are a little easier to do, right?
Yeah.
You could, and I was using a lot of other people's work, right? Wasn't like coming up with everything to position myself. But I like that. I still teach, when I teach people, I still teach, and I don't teach people a lot because I'm professional in other fields, but like with my kids or whatever, my son in particular, those books are the ending book. I think is still it's out of print. It's very hard to find. They were trying
Oh,
to sell it at Amazon for like $600. There's no copies left. Nobody has it. I
wow.
only have 2 copies. I only have 2 copies myself. I'm not giving any away.
Oh, you need to keep them like safe
No, I
with
can't. Yeah,
the
I can't get it.
Hmm.
So,
Wow.
so that's when I first started writing. I wrote a couple of books then. I enjoy writing. Part of my job is I'm a strategist. So in addition to the trading, I'm also a market strategist and I write for clients. So I've always enjoyed writing. So then through the years, I guess through most of the 90s, I played in the US Championship a few times. I got close to competing, but I never actually won the US Championship. I never came very close to winning. Then in 2009, 2010, my kids started playing, and my two sons started playing. Mitch in particular showed early signs of talent, and Sam, my other son, also showed some interest, but Mitch had more interest, a lot more interest in the game than Sam did. So around like 2012, we started playing in tournaments together. I started becoming a lot more active myself. So my kids started playing. Mitch in particular started playing. He was playing a lot, and I
That
started
brought you back.
I started playing more, and so, and also, work became, well, I was 45 years old, and I didn't have as many ambitions anymore at work as I did before, right?
Mm.
I was just kind of like, okay, I'm doing this. I've already done a lot of what I wanted to do, right? And
Mm.
in chess, I always felt that, given that I didn't become U.S. champion back in those days, but was close, I always felt that there was some, hidden abilities that hadn't yet been developed, right? I feel that still now, and I enjoy playing. I'm more active right now as a chess player than I have been ever, even though I'm also working full time.
Yeah.
I work remotely mostly, by remote connection, and I live in Tennessee. But I travel a lot. I've played already 3-4 tournaments this year, and I'm going to play in the Foxwoods tournament in Big Swiss here in the United States at the end of this month. So I play a lot, and I write a lot. In addition to the books, I write a column for the American Chess Magazine, Endgame column for them, which is a lot of work, but it's interesting for me.
Yeah.
And I started writing books. I met Hannon Russell about 7 years ago, I guess, and 7 or 8 years ago. So I started writing books. He's great to work with. Obviously has a huge amount of experience and knowledge in books, gives great advice. It appreciates, when people put in a conscientious effort. I kind of tend to err to the side of being too thorough sometimes, right? I try to
Get all the
make
details.
clean effort, right? And so, I started writing books again, in the late 2010s. You have something to say, you want to say it. And you kind of, I've lived for a while. I've played chess now for 50 years almost. And there's a new generation. You can teach them something. There's different approaches to looking at the game, and you have a little bit more wisdom to maybe parse out which approach works. And it's just interesting, like for me, and that's part of why I'm playing a lot, is just, number one, the game itself is interesting, the competitive element, but also how the game changes, right? I can talk to you a lot about how the game has changed in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years, the last 100 years, what the changes are, how people think about the game. It's interesting intellectually. So I write. So a lot of what I write is kind of, obviously it's for the reader, but also I'm not going to write a book unless I find it interesting myself,
Yeah.
And so, like the two books I wrote for Hannon, the Scotch Gambit, right, and
Yes.
the Exchange French, right?
Exchange French comes to life.
Yeah, the Exchange French is, I think, that's a little bit of a gem that's kind of hidden. A lot of people think the Exchange French is a boring opening that is just, people just play for a draw. But that's, for number one, that's not true. You see them, and you see those Exchange French games in tournaments at the top level now. There's not any boring. There's no boring draw there. But also, there's some basic pawn structures there that you get, like isolated pawn structures with the isolated queen pawn, positions with block pawns on the d file and open file, positions that might be symmetrical, but actually symmetrical positions can be very dangerous if you have an extra tempo, especially if it's an open position. So,
and you mentioned if
I wrote
black
the book.
plays boring moves that they won't do too well, right? Because this is a book for white.
Yeah. So it's from white's perspective. Yeah. And it's I tried to write that book from the point of view of teaching chess as opposed to just teaching about the Exchange French, right?
Okay.
it's less a theoretical manual, but more kind of a book about how to play certain types of positions.
Yeah.
So I would recommend that for that reason. It's not just if you don't play the French, that's okay, because you're going to get this position, this type of structure. You can get it in the Petrovs, very similar structure. You can get it in the Queen's Gambit accepted sometimes if they take the pawn in c4 in exchange French. You can get it obviously in a lot of different, Caro-Kann, a lot of different openings. You can get it in other lines of the French. And so if you don't play it, you still learn something about the game. If you do play it, you're going to want the book. Even if you don't want to play the system with white, you're going to want to have it if you're playing the French with black. So because it tries to be relatively honest about the analysis. So I would recommend the book even if you don't play the French, and I wouldn't discount it just because, well, the French is exchange French. I hate the opening or whatever. It's a little bit of a myth. The Scotch Gambit is an older book. I think it can probably do a revision, but it can use a revision. But on the other hand, it's also written. The positions there are strategically interesting also, but for a different reason. And maybe that book is geared toward a slightly more of an amateur player. And it's actually, maybe that's why it's doing better than the other book, is because it's maybe written for a wider audience. So those are the two books that I worked on before this latest kind of flurry of writing. And I think there's going to be more. The fast track, depending on how the fast track of Nimzovich goes, I can see other things, other classical books that could be redone as well.
Fast track brand with it.
We'll see how that goes. And I'm still hoping to eventually write some kind of autobiographical thing. None of these books I've written have almost any autobiographical details. And it would be along the lines of like for example, there's a recent book by Van der Sterren, Paul Van der Sterren, right?
Paul Van der Sterren. My Life in Black and White.
I haven't actually read the book, so I'm not going to say, when I say great book, I'm not saying that because I haven't read it. But it talks about how he thinks that people should accept the fact, because I saw his podcast, I heard his podcast on Ben Johnson's podcast, and he talks about how people should accept the fact that they're going to be weaker as they're going to lose some of the cognitive abilities, so to speak, as they grow up, as they get older. It doesn't mean they should stop. It doesn't mean they should, they should keep going, right? So now Paul himself reached a very high level in the 1990s, a much higher level and I played him in the 1990s. When I played him in early 90s, I actually beat him in a nice game, and he looked to me like he was kind of a run-of-the-mill grandmaster. But then, like suddenly 4 years later, or 2 years later, he's a candidate for the world championship in FIDE, and he stays at that level for several years. And you can see from the way he thinks that he's a real chess thinker. He's, so he reached a very high level, and I think he probably talks about a little bit of the kind of the reality, the reality, the accepting reality that you're just not going to be at that level anymore, right? It's just the time will just take over. So those are fair things, but they shouldn't stop a player from playing. And I want to, if I were to write something of my own on that topic, my example is one where, and there's a few other players in the United States of my age who play actively. Well, there's other people of my age who play better. Like, for example, Gregory Kaidanov, he was better in Speak than I was, quite a bit better. And he's better now, right? Shabalov was quite a bit better in Speak. Now he's slightly better, I think, than me. Joe Benjamin, same category. Maybe a couple of other people, but none of them play as much as I do. And frankly, none of them have really been tested in battles against 15-year-olds and 13-year-old kids. Which is a completely different game, right? And I do that. I try to search out tournaments. I don't just stick to senior tournaments. I search out tournaments where I'm playing against kids. I enjoy that challenge.
Okay. Wow, you're not hiding from the kids like most people.
I'm not. I want to play them. I'm not afraid of them.
Oh.
I
Mm.
understand I'm going to lose some games, lose rating points. Some of them are underrated. Well, FIDE put this change in where like anybody under 2000 is increased their
2000.
rating or whatever.
Mm.
And that should increase everybody around that level. It's not going to affect people at like 2400 level too much, but it'll affect it a little bit. At least, you know, some of the people at the lower levels are not going to be as underrated, let's say.
Yeah.
But but I see that as a challenge because they play a different game. And some of them they're very different styles also. Some of them play quickly, some of them don't. Well, they're all for the most part, they're all universal players these days, but some of them have different styles in terms of spending time on the board. And
Yeah.
I find that as more interesting than playing against people of my age, against whom I usually do pretty well. If I were to talk about, anything autobiographical, it would be how to sustain a keen interest in actually playing chess as opposed to just watching Carlsen or other people, to actually
Yeah.
enjoying the competitive element against opposition that's much younger. Like, for
That's
example,
an interesting take.
that's kind of what if I ever talk about, but I'm always of the kind of the opinion that I haven't played my best game yet. Yeah, if they ask me what's your best game, I haven't played it yet. I can maybe give one or two games, but so
Yeah.
I'm still hoping to eventually maybe even get, I don't know, getting the US Championship. That's maybe a little bit of a lofty goal. I can get lucky by winning the US Open, but I'm hoping to at least maybe get my rating back to close to my peak. And I think if I do, and I think that's a legitimate goal. And if I can
Yeah.
do that, then if I get back to 2500s, let's say, I think it's quite achievable. Then I can probably more credibly talk about playing and sustaining your
Yeah,
level.
everyone's gonna want to know how you did that because like this is not
But
something
yeah,
common,
so I'm kind
right?
of waiting for that. I'm almost 56 years old. I still have time. But on the other hand, even if I don't get to that level, just the idea that I am playing a lot and relatively well, I think is a story to be told. So,
Yeah.
I think that people should enjoy the game. I think the game is, and I think it's good for health reasons. I think it keeps your brain sharper. For example, I'll end with this part of the discussion with a story about my dad. In the United States, there's this, everybody in the United States knows about it. There's this thing called Amateur Team Championship, U.S. Amateur Team Championship, where you form teams of 4 players, but their rating the average rating has to be below United States 2200, which is equivalent
Yeah.
to FIDE about 2100. So that's the average. So you can have maybe even 2 grandmasters on the team, but you have to have 2 very weak players on the
Yeah.
team. So if you had 2 grandmasters or relatively weak players, so like 1600, which would be like FIDE 14 or 1500. And if you have 3, and sometimes teams have 3 very strong players and then 1 player rated about 1000. So we formed a team with my dad, who was 85 years old. Okay. And he taught me originally how to play, right? When I was growing up in the Soviet Union, he was a master strength player. In the United States, he reached eventually United States 2330, I think, at his peak. He beat Krzyzewski once. So he was a good player back when he was younger. But he hadn't played 85 years, and he hadn't played for about 8 years. And he wasn't really that great 8 years ago, but he came back, and he was awesome at the age of 85. So we formed a team where I was board 1, Mitch was board 2. Mitch is 23, almost 2300 USCF. My dad was board 3, and then board 4,
Family.
we had my other son. Yeah, family team.
Oh, the whole family too. Wow. Love
And
that.
yeah, and then he's rated about 1000. He was
Balance.
all in. He wanted to play, right? He's a soldier in the army. He's an officer in the army. And I also had an alternate in board 4, named Paul Cornelison. He was a friend of mine from college from a long time ago. He was also a master in his day. You don't lose that title, so he remains a master, but the ratings are all lower now.
Yeah.
So we were actually the top seed. Our average rating, because of Paul's rating, was 2000. Our average rating was 2199. So we were on board 1 in the first round. And I was thinking, there's no way that we could play anywhere near with my dad. I wasn't sure whether he'd even be able to play a couple, because I hadn't seen him play. And 85, he's physically strong. But
Yeah.
we know how hard it is to play a chess game. We know how hard it
And
is.
is it
He's
the
playing
time
against kids.
control? Was it
Time control
like
is 40 moves in 100 minutes with a delay. He's not used to the time control. Back in those
yeah.
days, it was longer, and he was incredible. He won. He drew the first game. He won the second game against a kid. So difference in age of 72 years. Okay.
Wow.
He beats the guy. The guy's rated about 2100. He beats the guy and he beats him sound. Like he just outplays him, basically. It wasn't like the guy blundered or anything. He just completely
Yeah.
positionally outplays him. Ridiculously good game. Then he takes a break the next game, and then it was a little bit tougher in the last day. But and he lost the game. But incredible. So he did well. Mitch won all those games on board two. We had a great tournament. I didn't have such a good tournament. I was in bad form. We wouldn't have won first place. We would have been competitive if I was in better form. I lost to Joe Benjamin. Could do that. That's excusable. I drew a couple of games against strong masters, but we had a lot of fun. And Sam on board four, he was sort of fed to the wolves. He was playing against experts. He didn't really have a. But he was
Yeah.
there like a true soldier, And then Paul was also had a tough time because he hadn't played for a while, and he was playing against strong players. So sometimes on board three. So we had a decent result, but it was a lot of fun. But I think that with my dad doing what he was doing, and with me still really decent at this age compared to still playing more or less at the grandmaster level.
Yeah.
I think it shows that I think that chess helps you sustain your kind of mental ability. It keeps
Yeah.
you, it's good. I mean, there have been studies that, and both of my parents are doing very well at that age, and my mom doesn't play chess, but there's been studies psychology that chess helps you kind of keep your mental sharpness. There's
Yeah.
less
And it
chess
helps
players.
against Alzheimer's and
Exactly.
diseases
They
like
have
that.
lower
Yeah.
proportion of Alzheimer's disease people. So
Yeah.
that's a story to be told. So
Yeah.
if I write books in the future about myself, that's kind of going to be the topic. But I think I'm still a ways from working on that.
Well, hopefully in this decade, right, as you
Hopefully,
mentioned
yeah, we'll
with
see.
the
We'll see. I
Doretsky
don't
book.
know.
And just listening to
Yeah.
you speak about like yourself, your chess, I can just really imagine being like hooked on your writing about your life and yourself. So I definitely like encourage an autobiography. That would be amazing. And not for the reasons you said, but also just the way you speak, the way you write, and everything you know about chess. I think you can
Well, I
add a lot
appreciate
of
that,
value.
and also there's some stories. There's some stories to be told. I think
Hmm.
there's I've had the privilege of meeting not being a professional, so like people like Gregory Kaidanov, a friend of mine, and let's say even Joe Benjamin, also a friend of mine, and other people of that generation have certainly met more famous people and more often than I have. And these people had personalities that were very interesting, and you didn't have access to them the way that like now you can look at the podcasts, you can look at Fabi Caruana or Magnus or whatever, you
Yeah.
can see them at interviews. This was before the computer age, but at the same time, people were real characters. Michael Tolla I had the privilege of meeting him. I met
Oh,
Korchnoi a
wow.
couple of times. So, and I played against some famous people of that era who are, very, very interesting personalities. So I
Yeah,
think that it would be interesting from that perspective too.
definitely. Thank you so much. This is awesome being able to speak to you
Okay.
and hear about your books and everything. Like I had questions, but you just answered everything that was in my
Well, if you have
mind.
any
Like
more questions,
you,
if you have any more questions, fire away. I'll try to be brief in answering
no,
this time.
so you literally answered everything I would have, even about the books. You went there and you do it so organically, you know. So that's why I think with your,
Yeah.
but
Well,
this
thank
is
you.
the writer's I think brain that you're just able to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
from one topic and have it flow. So thank you. You also made
Yeah. Well,
my
thank
job
you. Thank you.
easier.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. And we will
Okay.
link
Thank you.
all
Thank you
of the
very much,
books
Elise.
below. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.